good morning again. My name is Taylor. I'm the family's pastor here, and I typically teach our Parent Connect community group. But I am preaching this morning, so I'm in the chapel right now in our spiritual formation series. So we're going to continue our study of Ruth here via video. So if you have your Bibles, go ahead and turn to Ruth, and we're going to pick up in chapter 3. Just to give a recap of the first two chapters that we looked at last week, in case you weren't here or just need a good reminder. In chapter 1 of this short little story, we are presented with this kind of dire situation or a problem. And it's for Naomi and her daughter-in-laws. She had two daughter-in-laws, Orpah and Ruth, who had married her sons, but her husband died and her sons died, so she's kind of left with Orpah and Ruth. After some kind of pressuring, Orpah returns to her homeland, but Ruth is going to show, or she does show, loving kindness towards Naomi, and she wants to stick with Naomi and give her loyalty to Naomi and to Naomi's God, which is Yahweh, the Israelite. So Ruth gives this beautiful speech to Naomi about how she's going to cling to her. In chapter 2, we saw how Boaz is this other figure who extends loving kindness towards Ruth in the fields. And so we see this, and we're going to pick up the story here in chapter 3. So what I invite you to do is go ahead and read chapter 3. I'll give you a good amount of time to do that, and then we'll return and kind of discuss. But ask really good questions of it. Read it a couple times if you can, and then we'll jump back into it in a few. Let's go ahead and look at Ruth chapter 3. Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi, said to her, "My daughter, shouldn't I find rest for you so that you will be taken care of?" Now, isn't Boaz our relative? Haven't you been working with his female servants? This evening he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Wash, put on perfumed oil, and wear your best clothes. Kind of these three actions. Then go down to the threshing floor, but don't let the man know you are there until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, notice the place where he's lying. Go in and uncover his feet and lie down. Then he will explain to you what you should do." So Ruth said to her, "I will do everything you say." So Naomi is giving a plan to Ruth here. And it's an interesting plan. I mean, if we really think about it, this is a little scandalous. I know if I heard that my daughter was approaching a man in the middle of the night, all perfumed up and wearing her best clothes, I would be a little uneasy about this. So this is a little scandalous, and there's obviously some ancient imagery here that we don't understand. And I think there is some help we can get by looking at these kind of three main actions of washing, putting on perfume or oil, and wearing your best clothes. There is some clue as to what that's about when you read this passage in Ezekiel 16, okay? And if you're familiar with Ezekiel 16, or just the book of Ezekiel, it's filled with a lot of wild imagery. One of the images that is found there is of Yahweh kind of marrying Israel, or like Israel being a bride to Yahweh. And in describing Israel being a bride, it uses these same three actions. It says, God says, "I washed you with water, rinsed off your blood, and anointed you with oil. I clothed you in embroidered cloth and provided you with fine leather sandals. I also wrapped you in fine linen and covered you with silk." So these three actions of washing, anointing, and clothing, it seems to be tied to kind of a marriage process, or it's marriage imagery. So this leads us to believe that whatever Ruth is doing, it might have something to do with marriage. That's all we're going to say about it now, but it helps us a little bit. At the very least, this seems a little scandalous. Okay? And Ruth agreed to it. She says that she's ready to obey, even though this is a very dangerous thing to do in an ancient society. Kind of doing this would be viewed as almost reprehensible. If Ruth was caught doing this, there could be really dangerous consequences. So Ruth is agreeing to do it, everything she says, and this takes courage and bravery, and again shows her commitment to Naomi. All right, let's kind of keep going down here. So this is going to describe Ruth going about this whole plan. She went down to the threshing floor, and I just included a picture here of a threshing floor. It's where they would take their wheat, and I won't get into the whole process, but they're basically extracting the grain from this. And owners of fields would often sleep on their threshing floor to kind of protect it. So Boaz would at night kind of be sleeping here is a little odd, but not, or it's odd to us that you would sleep on the threshing floor, but in that time he's kind of protecting it in the middle of the night. So anyway, so she went down and did everything her mother-in-law had charged her to do. After Boaz had ate, drank, and was in good spirits, he's had a good time at a festival. There's a lot of festival imagery where he's in a festive spirit. He went down to lie down. He went to lie down at the end of the pile of barley, and she came secretly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. So, again, this is weird. What is this whole uncover his feet part? I'm not going to get super into it. I'll just tell you that this is an idiom for sexualized stuff in Hebrew. And I know that's a little tough to talk about. I at one point I taught through this with our students at one point, and this was a fun thing to get into. I didn't get into it in very much detail, but there's something about uncovering someone's feet that is linked to sexual activity. I'll just say that, okay? So it kind of heightens the whole scandal of what's going on here. It's putting some things in our mind that question what's going on. And so at the very least, what we can say is that this is a sexually charged situation, okay? And there's a lot of things that are highly suggestive about this encounter. But a lot of it has to do with this link to Genesis 19:30 through 37. This has to do with a character named Lot and his daughters. If you read those scenes back in that, it almost seems like the writer of Ruth is writing with this in the background. And this scene has to do with I have it here, the origin story of the Moabites. It shows how the Moabites came about. So Ruth being a Moabite makes sense that this is kind of hearkening back to this story. And Ruth and Boaz, it's kind of like reminding us or setting up our expectations with this story in the background. But as we will see, the actions of the characters in the Ruth and Boaz story are a lot different than what happens in this story or Genesis 38 with Judah and Tamar. So what I think the Bible is doing, it's setting up our expectations for what we think should happen so that it can actually kind of surprise us with what happens. So it's almost like this scene in Ruth is rhyming with that scene in Genesis 19 and Genesis 38. I didn't include that one here, but it has some resonances to that as well, as to set up our expectations. So I have this, I think about rhyming this way. Sometimes you read children's books, and I had this kind of moment recently. We were reading One Fish, Two Fish, Red Fish, Blue Fish. If you're familiar with this classic from Dr. Seuss. But just notice, there was this line, we see them come, we see them go. Some are fast, some are, hopefully you said slow. But because of the rhyme, the kind of the sequence and your reading, you're able to anticipate what's going to come next. And so I think this story in Ruth is actually rhyming with this previous story with Lot and his daughters, which is just a sexually bad situation. It's rhyming with that so that it can give us the expectation that we're expecting the word slow, but a different word comes out and it breaks the rhyme. So I think this is just brilliant storytelling. Hopefully that makes sense. I'm not just rambling on here, but I think the writer of Ruth is setting up this encounter with Ruth and Boaz as something similar to the previous story, but it's so that it can shatter our expectations and highlight the virtue of Ruth and Boaz. So I just think it's really good storytelling at work here. Okay, and that helps explain some of the weird imagery, hopefully. So anyway, let's continue on here. At midnight, Boaz was startled, turned over, and there was lying at his feet a woman. So he asked, "Who are you?" "I am Ruth, your servant," she replied. "Take me under your wing, for you are a family redeemer." Take me under your wing. This is odd imagery to us, but what we see throughout Scripture, you can look at like Psalm 91:4 or Matthew 23:37. This is a symbol that's often given to God about how he treats his people. He brings his people under his wing. And it's a symbol for God's covenantal love for his people, for his protection. So Ruth is asking for Boaz to show covenantal love towards her, to protect her, and also to become the family redeemer, to kind of restore the family line through marriage and whatnot. So I think this is a beautiful thing that we see Ruth asking for the same type of love God gives to his people for Boaz to extend to her. And what we see is Boaz partly accepts, right? Boaz says, "May the Lord bless you, my daughter. You have shown more kindness now than before because you have not pursued younger men." So he sees her being virtuous because she's not pursuing younger men or maybe someone who would be more typically suited for what she's asking, but instead she's seeking out Boaz. So he sees a virtue there. And he says, "Now don't be afraid, my daughter. I will do for you whatever you say." This is parallel to what Ruth said to Naomi. "Since all the people in my town know that you are a woman of noble character," which I think is interesting. Ruth has a reputation in the town. "Yes, it is true that I am a family redeemer, but there is a Redeemer closer than I am. So stay here tonight. And what he's saying there is something called levirate marriage in the Old Testament. You can read about this in Deuteronomy 25 if you're really interested in levirate marriage principles. If someone in the family, say they marry and this man dies, well, the brother of the one who died could marry to restore the widow. Does that make sense? So you have this guy and he marries this lady. Look at oh no. This is why I don't draw off the cuff. But say they're married and then he dies. Well, his brother over here, this is getting bad. He can marry her. That's what levirate marriage is. But usually it was the closest kin and it was the brother. And so, and then it kind of spawned out from there. Whoever's closest kind of could do it. And so what Boaz sees is that there's a closer relative that can redeem her and the property. And so Boaz wants to go at this the right way. Hopefully that didn't overcomplicate that. But what I'm saying is Boaz is trying to make sure that this goes about the right way. That's the lesson. And you don't need to know about all levirate marriages based on Deuteronomy 25 to know that. But anyway, so what Boaz says is stay here tonight, and in the morning, if he, the other guy, the closer redeemer, if he wants to redeem you, that's good. Let him redeem you. But if he doesn't want to redeem you, as the Lord lives, I will. Now lie down until morning. So she lay down at his feet until morning, but got up while it was still dark. And again, this is a dangerous situation, so she's leaving while it's still dark. Then Boaz says, don't let it be known that a woman came to the threshing floor. And he told Ruth, bring the shawl you're wearing and hold it out. When she held it out, he shoveled 6 measures of barley into her shawl, and she went into the town. Okay, so you have this episode, and she still leaves undetected. And the most alarming thing in all of this is that it did not turn out like the story of Lot and his daughters. You get to the end of the story, and you see, oh, nothing sexual happened. And anything, there's just virtuous behavior happening here. Even Boaz, he's being careful about how he goes about redeeming Ruth and everything. So I think that would be alarming to an original reader who has the story of Lot and his daughters in the background. With all the rhyming that's taken place and all the expectations you have, you're shocked that Ruth and Boaz are actually virtuous people and they're going to go about things the right way. And in fact, this story of Lot and his daughters that have sexual activity, again, the Bible is not PG. It's that births the Moabite people. And so what you see here is this virtuous action with the Moabite. It's kind of reversing the story. Like, it's reversing the bad sexual kind of things that happened. We're going to see that Ruth and Boaz's action kind of set a new trajectory for the Moabite people and for the people of Israel. So I think there's a lesson there about love and kindness and virtue reversing the script of our lives. But then Ruth goes back to Naomi and she tells her what happened. And Naomi says, okay, well, just wait for Boaz because he's going to do the right thing. Okay, so we're primed for the next chapter, chapter 4. Go ahead and read that. Again, I'll give you a few good minutes. Read it over again and ask really good questions. This is a climactic point of the story, so have fun. Here we go. Let's go back and, why not go back? We'll go forward and look at Ruth chapter 4. Ruth chapter 4. Hopefully you had some good conversation. Let's look at the first few verses here. Boaz went to the gate of the town and sat down there. This is usually where town business was held, at the town gate. And soon the family redeemer Boaz had spoken about came by. Boaz said, "Come over here and sit down." So he went over and sat down. There's something we don't see in the English here, but it's almost like he says, "Hey, you so and so," in the Hebrew. In other words, the Hebrew is intentionally not naming this individual, which I think is fascinating. They want this person to remain anonymous for some reason or the other. But anyway, so he went over and sat down. Then Boaz took 10 men of the town's elders and said, "Sit here." So 10 men of the town's elders sit here with this guy. And they sat down. And he said to the Redeemer, so-and-so, "Naomi, who has returned from the territory of Moab, is selling the portion of the field that belonged to our brother Elimelech, or Elimelech, I've heard it pronounced, whichever you prefer. I thought I should inform you. Buy it back in the presence of those seated here." And these are the elders, right? "And in the presence of the elders of my people. If you want to redeem it, do it. But if you do not want to redeem it, tell me so that I will know, because there isn't any other than you to redeem it, and I am next after you." The man answered, "I want to redeem it." So, this is what's happened here, right? Elimelech had a family in Israel, probably had a land and stuff. And as things were getting worse, famine was happening, he probably started selling off his land to make ends meet. And then a final last-ditch effort is to kind of move. And so Elimelech goes to Moabite territory, and that's where his sons find wives, and then he dies, whatever. And that's why when Naomi comes back, she doesn't have land because probably Elimelech sold it in the first place. So they're trying to buy back the land. That's what it means to redeem it. But there's someone who has dibs to that, and it's this other unnamed figure. And so Boaz is kind of catching him up to speed here and saying, "Hey, there's this land that you could redeem. If you want it, do it. If not, I'm going to take it." So that's kind of how he leaves it. And the guy's like, "Yeah, I want to redeem it. I'll redeem it." As Boaz continues, he says, "On the day you buy the field from Naomi, you will acquire Ruth the Moabitess." And notice that he emphasizes the Moabitess part. "The wife of the deceased man, to perpetuate the man's name on his property." The Redeemer replied, "I can't redeem it myself. or I will ruin my own inheritance, take my right of redemption because I can't redeem it. So he has a quick change of heart there. And the determining factor seems to be that he finds out if he redeems this land, he gets Ruth the Moabite as well. And this is somehow tied to ruining his own inheritance. And that's why he doesn't want to do it. Now, what's interesting here is levirate marriage, buying back the land, redeeming the land. It's actually not required to marry the widow in order to do that. And this is something, I didn't know until you start digging into people that are studying these things more closely. But as you read Deuteronomy 25, 5 through 10, and you read into kind of levirate marriage and what this means to redeem the land, you start to notice that there was not a legal obligation to marry the widow. Only really immediate brothers had that. So what that means is Boaz is not appealing to the letter of the law here by saying, when you redeem the land, you're going to have Ruth as well. Instead, he's appealing to kind of the spirit of the law. Sorry, there's people outside my door if you can hear them talking. He's appealing to the spirit of the law, or another way to think about this is the moral trajectory of the law. What the law was really all about. The moral of the law was to take care of those who no longer had land or provisions. So Boaz is saying, hey, if you do this, if you really want to follow the law and redeem the land, you have to marry Ruth. And so I think one thing that just shows us is that Boaz himself, as we'll read on, and he wants to redeem the land, is he wants to go above and beyond the letter of the law or the moral or the legal requirements. He wants to appeal to the very spirit of the law and to care for those the law was designed to care for. And this is, I think, just an important lesson for us. Hesed, in Hebrew, loving kindness, or love and this covenantal loyalty, is a call to go above and beyond just moral requirements and to sincerely seek out the good of others. That's what's so virtuous about Boaz here. He doesn't just want to check the box and doing the right thing. He actually cares for Ruth, and he cares for perpetuating this man's name, the family line. So I think this is a beautiful picture of virtue that's often hidden from us because we're not familiar with actual Levitical law and how that works. So I think Boaz has actually exercised his wits here a little bit, and he's almost swept away every obstacle virtuously, or at least in a way that preserves his own virtue so that he can redeem Ruth and go about things. Okay, so now this guy is out of the way, the one who had the rightful heir or rightful right to redeem, and now Boaz can do it. So now we're going to have a little note from the narrator here, which I wish there were more of these in the Bible. But at an earlier period in Israel, a man removed his sandal and gave it to the other party, and this is why, in order to make any matter legally binding concerning the right of redemption or the exchange of property. So this was the method of legally binding a transaction in Israel. One guy would take off his sandal and give it to the other person, and that would then be the sign of legally binding redemption practices. There's something to do with feet in this story that I think we're just not able to understand being distant readers of the Bible, but the narrator gives us that little clue and helps us to understand this practice, and then we see the Redeemer removed his sandal and said to Boaz, buy back the property yourself. Imagine if we just had this verse and we didn't have this verse, how much more confusing that would be. We would just read, so the man removed his sandal and gave it to Boaz. But thankfully, the narrator helps us out in understanding. So at the very least, what we see is a legal contract is struck, and it means passing a sandal back and forth to each other, but that's fine. Okay, we continue verse 9. Boaz said to the elders and all the people, so a whole kind of crowd is gathered here. You are witnesses today that I am buying from Naomi everything that belonged to Elimelech, Kilion, and Mahlon. I have also acquired Ruth the Moabite. Mahlon's widow. First time you find out it was Mahlon. As my wife, and this is why. Why is he doing this? To perpetuate the deceased man, and this is Elimelech, to perpetuate his name on his property. So his name will not disappear among his relatives or from the gate of his hometown. So Boaz is doing this to perpetuate the name of Elimelech and to continue it. And all the people who were at the city gate, including the elders, said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is entering your house like Rachel and Leah." This is a remarkable blessing from the people. These, Rachel and Leah, are matriarchs of Israel. And here they are asking that this Moabitess woman would receive that same blessing, a foreigner. It's a beautiful picture of what God's intention for Israel was, that they would not just be a blessing to themselves, and God was not just concerned about them and giving them favor. He was also concerned that they would become a blessing to all nations. And here that's what we see. God blessing the nations. Who together built the house of Israel. May you be powerful in Ephrathah, and your name well known in Bethlehem. Do you remember that's the first place that was mentioned? Beginning of the story. May your house become like the house of Perez, the son of Tamar, bore to Judah. Because of the offspring the Lord will give you by this young woman. So another story is linked here, and I've mentioned it earlier, but Genesis 38 is the story of Tamar and Judah. Another sexually scandalous story, if you go back and read Genesis 38. But Judah and Tamar have Perez, and then Perez kind of grows up to become the Judahites, a very powerful clan. And this just shows us, one commentator says, that Genesis 38 has been in the background of this the whole time. It's another situation where levirate marriage was involved, and a brother had died and whatnot. But this is about kind of restoring Judah and the people of Israel. And I think it's another instance of reversing the script to a bad situation that was documented in Genesis 38. So there's a lot at work here in this little short story. But as things close out, we see blessing, we see prosperity, restoration, and it comes to a head also in focusing on Naomi. This is kind of the beautiful, right before the credits scene here in Ruth. Boaz took Ruth and she became his wife. He slept with her, and the Lord granted conception to her. This is only the second time. There's only 2 times in the book of Ruth where God is the subject of a verb, where God did something. The other place is in 1:6, where Naomi's talking about God had caused affliction. This is the only other time the Lord does something in the book, and it's framed as a miracle. This is supposed to be kind of miraculous. He granted conception to her, and she gave birth to a son, so the name can perpetuate. The women of the town said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you without a family redeemer today. May his name become well known in Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. Indeed, your daughter-in-law," this is Ruth, "who loves you and is better to you than 7 sons," which is Israel talk or ancient talk of saying it's better than the most idealistic family you could have. Ruth has given birth to him. So Ruth is just this source of blessing and goodness poured out on Naomi. Naomi took the child, placed him on her lap, and became a mother to him. So this restoration of Naomi is just huge. It's like, oh wow, this son is also bringing, Naomi, who had so much bitterness and loss at the beginning of her life or beginning of the story, joy, and it's just this restoration story that's happening for Naomi. And the neighbor women said, "A son has been born to Naomi," and they named him Obed. Obed was the father of Jesse, the father of David. And that's kind of where the hammer drops to this story, that you're like, oh, now I realize why I've been reading this story in the Hebrew Bible. It's because we're talking about the great grandparents of David, one of the most important kings. And so then the book of Ruth, as you'll have noticed, it ends with a genealogy. It ends with kind of documenting how this gets to David. So you had Elimelech and Naomi. They had Mahlon and Chilion who died. Elimelech died. Orpah went back to Moab. I guess you can say back to Moab. So she left. And you just had Ruth and Naomi in the story until chapter 2, where Ruth meets Boaz, and they have a son named Obed. Obed has Jesse, and we know Jesse becomes the father of the most notorious king in Israel history. Look at this, getting detailed here. David. Another fun fact, you don't know this, but Boaz's dad is mentioned as Salmon or Salmon, if you just want to, pronounce it how you see it. And what we find in, I think it's Matthew, I'll have to find an exact reference. But Matthew 1, if you look at the genealogy in Matthew 1 of Jesus, we find out that Salmon, had sexual relations with Rahab, which is from Jericho, also a non-Israelite woman. Important character in the genealogy of Jesus. But anyway, this is why I'm just showing kind of the big backdrop to this whole story. We've zoomed in on kind of just this little part, but this is a big picture that's unfolding here, where God is preserving his line, which will produce King David, which we know produces King Jesus ultimately. And again, you read Matthew 1 and you see how this genealogy works out. It mentions Ruth, it mentions Rahab, it mentions some key women, non-Israelite women in the genealogy, which was, again, it was rare for an ancient genealogy to mention women at all. But the biblical story wants to highlight this, that God's providence, his way of working in the world, comes through, you can say unlikely means or methods, but also through just great virtue. I mean, Ruth and Boaz are just epitomes of virtue and love throughout this whole story. And that it came from Ruth, the Moabitess, is surprising, but it just highlights how God often works. We can take comfort in that. So, okay, I do want to still give you a few minutes. How does this relate to us? How can you relate it to you today, reading this ancient story? Maybe we have time for me to come back and share mine, maybe not. But go ahead and take a few minutes. Just kind of reflect on this whole short story and think about what that teaches you as a follower of Jesus today. All right, I'm going to have a few things for us, just 4 quick things. And again, these aren't exhaustive. It's not the only thing you can see in these stories, but nonetheless, these are things that as I once again reread this story, I was just blown away by. Number 1, God often works through his people to answer their prayers. I think it's interesting that if you look back in Boaz's prayer to Ruth in chapter 2, he actually he prays that God would protect her and spread his wings over her. That's what he prays for Ruth in chapter 2. And then you see that he actually provides that in chapters 3 and 4, ultimately. So God, it's this crazy cool picture of how God works through Boaz to actually answer Boaz's prayers. So I think that's just a really cool thing. Secondly, our loving kindness, how we express love, should reflect the loving kindness of God. That's what Ruth asked Boaz for, that God would uh, cover her with his wings and protect her and show that covenant loyalty to her. And that's what Boaz does. So I think our love should reflect the love of God. If we want to know how to love people well, we should look at how God loves us and how God has loved us in and through Jesus. These are compelling things as well. I think what we see is the Moabite-Israel relations were littered with a lot of scandalous stories and just kind of bad interactions. And throughout Ruth, we see this reversal of relations between Moabites and Israelites. Instead of being enemies or being clouded in sexual scandal, it's actually two virtuous people coming together and bringing about a good ruler for the people of Israel. And they do that through just love and virtuous action towards one another. So I think we just see this compelling picture of love rewrites the story. Love can rewrite the story. No matter what mess ups, screw ups, or bad history or past things you've struggled with, love is transformative and has the power to rewrite your story. And we talked about that a little last week, but emphasize it again. Lastly, and this was just something I saw for the first time in studying this again, but love goes above and beyond. Remember, we talk about how Boaz was appealing to this redeemer and saying, hey, if you redeem the land, you got to marry Ruth. That's actually not a legal obligation. What Boaz is saying is, if you really want to follow the law, if you really want to do what God instructs his people to do, then you'll care for this Moabite woman. And I think that's a challenging thing for each of us, that love is more about actually caring for people, showing kindness and compassion to people. And if we really want to follow God's instructions, that's what we should be pursuing. Not just to check the box and follow the letter of the law, but the spirit of the law. And I think those are some takeaways that I've gotten from the book of Ruth on this go round. I look forward to studying it again one day and seeing what else God shows me. But hopefully you saw some good and encouraging things as well. Okay, I should be back in person with us next week. And we'll be in 1 Samuel, I think chapter 7, looking at David, or 2 Samuel 7. Anyway, I'll send out an email. I'll clarify. All right, we'll see you then.